Testimony Tuesday with Dr. Elizabeth Rex. Today on The Simple Truth, we consecrate everything to the Sacred Heart of Jesus through the Immaculate Heart of Mary and the pure, strong, chaste heart of St. Joseph. I'm your host, Jim Havens, and our guest today is Dr. Elizabeth Rex. She is a Catholic bioethicist and the president of the Donum Vitae Institute. You can find her and her good work over at donumvitaeinstitute.org. Dr. Elizabeth Rex, welcome to The Simple Truth. How are you today?
I'm fine. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Excellent. Yeah, great blessing to have you with us. So we always begin at the beginning on Testimony Tuesday. What was your early life like, your family, the culture that you grew up in?
I'm going to be honest. I was born in February 1949. I was a baby boomer right after World War II. And my parents were living in California. And I took my sweet time arriving after they were married at an early age. My mother was anxious to have a baby right away, and I didn't cooperate. And her father was not well, and she was hoping to have a grandchild before he passed, but he passed. And then the stress was over, and they didn't. I wasn't born for 4 years, but someone recommended that they get a puppy, a little dog, and it was Skippy, and I came right along. I think it helps people who are suffering with infertility sometimes too. I know it helped us, and I'll tell my story later on about how my husband and I were married later in life and faced infertility for 4 years and looked into adoption and raised some baby cockatiel birds. We had a double clutch, 9 baby birds we had to feed constantly. And that's when I got pregnant at age 44 and gave birth at age 45. I gave hope to a lot of my friends who were about my age. But I grew up in California. We lived right on the ocean, Newport Beach. Looked out our window and it was the sand and the ocean, Catalina Island. We were 5 children, ultimately, that lived in a 2-bedroom little beach cottage. We all attended public schools. My parents were not Catholic. I was baptized Presbyterian, and my mother wanted to become an Episcopalian. She went to a girls' school that was run by the Episcopal Church, and she later became an Episcopalian. My dad was an agnostic, very smart, valedictorian, full scholarship to college, joined the Navy during World War II. And after the war, they married and moved back to California. And that's when their family started. And I loved, walking on the beach, body surfing, collecting shells and sailing. I had a wonderful friend who had a sailboat and taught me how to sail. Joined the Girl Scouts. Her mother and my mother were the Girl Scout leaders. So pretty normal, happy, growing up until the 8th grade, and graduated from junior high school. And then my parents had this great idea to move to Mexico. And we moved to Mexico with 5 children down to Guadalajara, Mexico. We were going to live there for a year and maybe move to Spain for a year. My parents wanted us to be exposed to another culture, another language, broaden our horizons, and we loved it. It was hard to leave our friends, and back then, my sister and I, it was a girls' school, 1,000 students, Catholic school. We were the only non-Mexicans, so I know what it's like to be an immigrant. And we were the only 2 Americans in the whole school. Amazing, wonderful. My sister was younger, 9 years younger, and we had to learn Spanish. It was hard. My sister picked it up right away, being younger, but I struggled with it. But then it happens. You learn a language, and I did really well. I was always a good student, and so I graduated from Mexican high school, and that senior year, one of my friends in my classroom knew I was not Catholic. She was the only one who ever approached me and said, would you like to pray the rosary? Today's Our Lady of the Rosary. And I said, sure. And then when we made a little pilgrimage to a shrine of Our Lady, she explained the mysteries to me. The 5 joyful mysteries, I think they were. And I was so impressed at her because for her it was real. And then she invited me to a center of Opus Dei. And they have formation activities. There's a priest who'll give a weekly talk. And I went, and I wanted to believe in God, but I didn't have faith. I really didn't. And I especially had trouble with the Eucharist. How could God, the creator of the universe, be there in the tabernacle? And blood and wine. And no, can't be. How could that be? And so, but I wanted to believe. And I studied the catechism. They said I didn't have to do it, but I wanted to. I wanted to learn the Catholic faith. And it took about a while, but my senior year, thanks to prayer of the ones who were guiding me, helping me, the formation activities, the day came that I received the gift of faith. It wasn't something that I did. It was as I was trying, but it wasn't coming. But then it came. And now, if you want to, you can believe. And I said, I do. And then I believed. And I told my friend that I can believe now. And I believed in the Eucharist. I believed everything. It was just amazing. It was just, from black and white to technicolor, everything just changed when you know that God created the universe, created each one of us. This beautiful world is his loving creation, and he has a plan for us. He died for us, and we need to serve him. And I wanted to serve him right away. So I became a faithful, practicing Catholic. And not only when I graduated, I went on to study in Boston. I wanted to be a doctor because I'd always liked science, chemistry, biology, physics, math. I was pretty good in all that. And I had a woman doctor who saved my life. When I was a little girl, I got pneumonia, and penicillin had just been discovered. So I was in the hospital, but I made it. And I thought I'll be a doctor. So, but then when I moved to New York and I went to Columbia University. I transferred my sophomore year. I had also been at a boarding school in California for 2 years, and the headmistress was not married. She was single. She dedicated her whole life to educating young women. This is the school my mother went to. I went there. I was a boarder. I loved that school. And that was before I went back to Mexico and graduated from high school down there. But during that time, it was Episcopal school. Their hymn, the school hymn, I focused on the words, "Use me, Lord, use even me, just as thou wilt, and when and where." And that's been like a recurring theme throughout my life because it's taken many twists and turns, ups and downs. And I often think that if I write a biography, it'll be blessings in disguise, how things that may have been difficult really turned out to be blessings in the end. And so God uses the good times and the bad times. And so after finishing, I switched to education. I thought I'll spend my life educating other young women. I wasn't planning on getting married. And so I went into education. And then I wanted to go on and get a master's and a doctorate, believe it or not, in University of Navarra, because I spoke fluent Spanish. It was an Opus Dei university, very prestigious, very good, very solid. And they had I liked international education. I graduated from a Mexican high school, right? And I thought it was wonderful. I learned so much, during my years in Mexico. I had so many Mexican friends. My sister's now moved down to Mexico. She still has tons of friends down there, and she's retired down there. My brother's also moving down there. We just made so many friends. It was such a wonderful experience. And so I went to Rome. There was an international program in educational sciences in Rome with students from all over the world. There were maybe about 80 of us, just almost every country imaginable. I thought that would be great. And it was great. And I got my master's and doctorate in Thomistic ethics. It was educational sciences, but it also, you could major and specialize in philosophy or theology. I majored in ethics. I'd taken a course in ethics in high school down in Mexico, and it just was fascinating to see how the great philosophers and just life and morality, all of that was so incredible to the moment that here we are, and gave me a solid foundation, and that's what I specialized in.
Yes, incredible. Dr. Elizabeth Rex is with us. We're going to have more with her in just a moment. Again, to learn more about her and her good work, Donum Vitae Institute.org. Also, you can see her in person if you're in the D.C. area or the Maryland area. She's got a presentation coming up in the D.C. area on Thursday, a pro-life symposium defending life at conception and in the Constitution. Same event that our friend Professor Dr. Hadley Arcus is going to be a part of, and many more. Missy Smith. You can learn more at wakeup.mom to learn more about that one. Also, the presentations in Maryland, you can learn more about those. Those are going to be this upcoming Friday. Defendlife.org for more on those events. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. Welcome back to The Simple Truth. Jim Havens here with our guest today, Dr. Elizabeth Rex, Catholic bioethicist and president of the Donum Vitae Institute, donumvitaeinstitute.org. Excited to dive back in with Elizabeth here in just one moment. But first, if you are buying or selling a home, there's an easy way to help the Station of the Cross at the same time. Real Estate for Life has 1,400 experienced, morally grounded agents in the U.S. and Canada. Visit realestateforlife.org to find a Christ-centered, experienced realtor near you. And don't forget to mention the Station of the Cross. All right, again, Dr. Elizabeth Rex is with us. So you brought us up to your graduation with your PhD, and so what happened then? What was the work that the Lord summoned you to from there?
Well, He prepared me in ethics. I had my master's and my doctorate, and when I went back to the United States, I worked in high schools, girls' schools. I taught, and then I actually was headmistress of a Catholic girls' school in Boston. And from there, I went back to my alma mater, Barnard College, Columbia University in New York City. And I worked in the admissions office there. And then I switched over to Columbia College, Columbia University, and worked in the dean's office. And I was the assistant dean for academic affairs. I worked right with the dean and the associate dean, and learned all about education. And I got my master's in business, an MBA degree, and I was involved in educating the future leaders while being Catholic. And believe it or not, the chaplain at Columbia University, wonderful priest, Monsignor Maloney, Christopher Maloney, had been secretary to Cardinal O'Connor. And long story short, at that time, about 39 years old, that maybe I should look into marriage. And I thought, well, how are you going to meet somebody? And there was a Jewish matchmaker in New York City, Helena's, and I paid $5,000. I got my first credit card, and I thought, I'm going to try to meet someone who, and sure enough, he was also looking to get married. That was their purpose, was to help people find a partner for marriage. And so it was a blind date, and I met the love of my life, through them. Charles Rex, who was a concert violinist, he was associate concertmaster of the New York Philharmonic, and we met at a concert, and we were married in less than a year. He was a devout Protestant, scripture scholar, Presbyterian, and really knows, had incredible memory. He's just excellent with scripture, and he had gone to a very prominent Presbyterian church in Philadelphia when he was with the Philadelphia Orchestra for many years. So we were rock solid on God, but I respected him too much. And being a convert myself, I was going to let God take charge of that. And he did. After 30 years of marriage, he finally converted. So we are now going to daily mass together. We've been married for 35 years. So blessed to have each other in our lives. And we were married in St. Patrick's Cathedral because to our wedding without even asking us. So we had to go to a large church, and it was $125 to rent the St. Patrick's Cathedral, but we did, and we had Columbia University on one side and Philadelphia, the New York Philharmonic on the other side, my husband's side. And we are just so grateful to God for our happy, holy marriage. But we wanted family. And so that's where infertility raised its ugly head. And of course, I was older. I was 40. My husband was 40. We checked ourselves out, and nothing. So they said, look into adoption. So we started looking into adoption. And there's all kinds of different kinds of adoption. So foster care, domestic, international. There's siblings, there are older children, handicapped children. And there was no internet back then. A lot of people today are able to find their websites that help place children for adoption. But there were blue books back then. We got them in the library. So while we were looking into adoption, I got pregnant. And it was amazing. At 44, we couldn't believe it. So being older, the doctor said, medical leave, you go home, this is your only chance. So I had a medical leave, and our son was born. I was 45. And we looked at each other and said, wow, adoption really works. Let's try that again. And so we looked into adoption again. And this time, we were able to adopt a newborn in Atlanta, Georgia. It was the adoption lawyer that had helped my brother-in-law and sister-in-law adopt a child. So they had already adopted their child, and there was a young woman who was just 19. And over the phone, we just spoke, and we said, we'd be happy to adopt your child. And she was 8 months pregnant. My husband was overseas, but he came back. We flew down to Atlanta, and our son was born the next day. And we were the first ones to hold him. His birth mother said she was so glad she chose adoption. She said she had a lot of friends who made another choice, but she was grateful that we had adopted her son, and she knew he would have a good life. And so we were so blessed. Now we had 2 boys, 2 years apart. And we thought, wow, adoption is amazing. And my husband being a violinist, and I had some time because I was a stay-at-home mom, we did little recitals to raise money for pregnancy centers who help women choose life and consider adoption. So we had a concert in our home. We had a nice home in Yonkers, New York. And about 40 people came, and we raised about $1,000, and we gave it to Chris Slattery, expectant mother care, who has saved thousands of children with his pregnancy centers. And he explained at the intermission that what had happened last week. A couple came in, they couldn't speak English, and they were Russian, It was a love child. They couldn't support themselves. They were both artists, and they thought they walked into Planned Parenthood, and they walked into a pregnancy center. So he said, if you want help to, find someone to adopt the baby, I'll help you get through the pregnancy. They said they'd want to meet that person. So he didn't know if they would come back. That's what he told everybody. But after our little recital, we gave him the money, and he said, if they come back, we'd love to adopt again. So he called us the next day, and they were in his office in the Bronx. And he said, can we come up to your house? I said, absolutely, bring them. So they said yes. They met us, we met them, and the rest is history. She was 8 weeks, so we went through 7 months of doctors, and they were artists, and they painted beautiful Madonna and Child, and they sold the paintings. We helped them sell the paintings. They could support themselves through the pregnancy. We were so blessed. A little girl, and she's just amazing. She's now 27, and at Catholic University, she's going for a doctorate in piano performance. She got a full scholarship to Catholic University. She was valedictorian of her class. She has piano talent. She got she's just a blessing, and her first words, me do it, very independent. And she's called me one day and she said, Mom, I'm leaving for Russia tomorrow. And she was like a sophomore in college. I want to go meet my birth mother. I have to go. She thinks I hate her, and I want to tell her how grateful I am to her. And I said, you have my blessings. I'll be praying for you. Have a good trip. She's like 19 years old, and she's flying to Russia by herself. She had saved up her money. She got her passport, everything. They had the most wonderful visit. She met her birth mother. She looks so much like her. She met her birth father. They never married. They were not married. He was married to someone else. And she met all of her half-siblings. There were like 5 or 6 half-siblings, an older brother on her mother's side and several little girls on the father's side. She played the piano for them. They had the best visit. They were all so happy that they had chosen life and had chosen adoption. So it was very moving when she came back and told us all of this. And then we started a nonprofit organization. We're going to get serious and raise money for pregnancy centers. They need money. They need help to help women choose life and consider adoption. We've been blessed with adoption. This is what we have to do. So we started the Children First Foundation. And my husband said, we're naming it after the birth parents who put their children first. And they made that loving choice to choose life, to give the gift of life to their child, and to give us the gift of life with a child that we could love in our lives. So the Children First Foundation, we're a nonprofit, and we were dedicated to promoting adoption as a positive choice for an unplanned pregnancy. That's our mission statement. And we're doing little concerts and raising a few $1,000s here and there, when on the front of the National Catholic Register, there was a picture of a little cute license plate called the Choose Life license plate. It had just been approved in Florida. And that was in the year 2000 and then 2001. And it had raised $300,000 like in 4 months, because so many people bought the Choose Life license plate, and it raises $20 per license plate. And so with 40,000 plates on the road, in no time, it was raising $800,000 a year in Florida. License plates raise awareness and they raise money. And that's why there's so many of them in Florida. And so we thought, wow, let's start a license plate, a Choose Life license plate in New York. I guess we didn't realize what we were getting into, but we did. And we were entitled to a Choose Life license plate. It was an organizational plate. It wasn't a legislative plate, but organizations could get their own license plate, and that was going to be our logo. And Smiling Children, the words Choose Life, and a pro-adoption mission. And it got rejected. And we didn't give up, and we sued. And it was an 11-year federal lawsuit. We've raised over $200,000 and given it to pregnancy centers in the tri-state area. It was an amazing venture, and that led us to embryo adoption, which we'll talk about in our next segment.
Yes, Dr. Elizabeth Rex is with us. Donum Vitae Institute.org is where you can learn more about her and her good work. She's president of the Donum Vitae Institute. So when we get back, we're going to dive into that good work. Embryo adoption. What is it? What's the landscape? We're going to learn as much as we have time for from Dr. Elizabeth Rex as soon as we get back. Stay tuned. Welcome back to The Simple Truth. Jim Havens here with our guest today, Dr. Elizabeth Rex, sharing some of her personal testimony and good work with us. She's a Catholic wife and mother, also Catholic bioethicist, and the president of the Donum Vitae Institute, donumvitaeinstitute.org. And we're going to get right back to Elizabeth. But first, don't forget about iCatholic Mobile for your mobile phone needs. When you subscribe to iCatholic Mobile, you do help fund the Station of the Cross. Check out iCatholic Mobile, iCatholicMobile.com. All right, Elizabeth. So share with us a little bit. Yes, how did you get into this work regarding embryo adoption? And then what does this consist of? Anything you want to share with us to get us oriented?
I heard about embryo adoption when it was published in the New York Times. It was, the year was 2005, and Italy. Oh, John Paul he passed away in 2004. But I have a quote from him that was from 2003. So, of course, those who know a little bit about Donum Vitae and Dignitas Personae, those are the two magisterial instructions written about the problems of artificial reproductive techniques, ART. And of course, John Paul, when he was elected back in 1978, the big issue was artificial contraception. Humanae Vitae had been published in 1968. After 10 years, John Paul was elected Pope, and he spent many of the first years of his pontificate explaining theology of the body and why artificial contraception violates marriage and the spouses. The unitive and the procreative meanings of the marital act are meant to be inseparable, always open to life, always for the fullness of the gift of each other to each other. One flesh, the gift of life that comes from that union with God's creation of the soul. Parents provide the body. God creates our soul and infuses it into our bodies, like Mary. We have the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. We know that God creates our soul at the first instant of our conception. So these little embryos that were 1978 was the birth of the first test tube baby, Louise Brown. It was 3 months before John Paul was elected Pope, so they coincide. But he doesn't get around to writing Donum Vitae to condemn artificial procreation until 1987, and it was the instruction Donum Vitae on the gift of life. Beautiful. Your listeners, you must read this document. We need to know what the Catholic Church teaches. And as you know, people who are suffering from infertility are just longing for a baby. And so IVF took off. And by the time Donum Vitae was written, there were hundreds of thousands of babies that had been conceived using IVF. And not just IVF, in vitro fertilization, but artificial insemination and surrogacy. So these are three different techniques of artificial procreation. And there are two types, from the egg and the sperm from the husband and wife who are married. That's called homologous IVF. But if the wife is infertile or the husband is infertile, then there's a temptation to use donor eggs or donor sperm or both, and even a surrogate using IVF and or insemination. And the surrogate is involved with those artificial procreation techniques, either IVF or insemination, and she's paid for the gestation of the baby and then has agreed by contract to relinquish the baby when it's born. So surrogacy is one of the techniques of artificial procreation that the Catholic Church condemns, rightly condemns. And babies should not be created in a petri dish or insemination or in a surrogate womb. But there is also the problem of freezing. So as IVF developed, they would fertilize more eggs than they could transfer to the mother. Usually no more than 2, maximum 3. You don't ever know if you're going to get triplets or twins, 1 or none. So they would sometimes collect the eggs and fertilize all of them. And there could be as many as 10, 15, 20 or more embryos. They transfer 1, 2, or 3 and freeze the others in case none of them would implant. They could go back and thaw some of the other ones and try again. So as it happens, sometimes they would get triplets, but they still got 20 in the freezer. And they say, we're done. And now there are frozen embryos in the freezer. And so when Donum Vitae was written, that was beginning to be a serious problem. But from 1987 to 2008, which is when Dignitas Personae was written, which was 10 years, 20 years, almost 20 years later, there are hundreds of thousands of frozen embryos. And now Pope Benedict asks the question, we're not going to give them to research or experimentation, that's wrong. Can't keep them frozen, that's wrong. It kills, it harms them, it deprives them, it even says this, deprives them of maternal reception, shelter, and gestation. That's wrong. That's really what an abortion is. If you prevent implantation or gestation, it's going to kill the embryo one way or another. If they just leave them there, or if they discard them, thaw them and discard them, or if, again, they give them to research. And what are the other options? Well, they ask the question, could prenatal adoption be licit? And of course, the intention is clearly licit. Orphans need to be adopted, and it's just an orphan at an earlier age and stage, especially if it's a pre-implantation embryo. And all of us, including Jesus and Mary, were pre-implantation embryos for about a week. Now we know that between the zygote, and I'm going to show a little picture here, these are pre-implantation embryos. So you have the zygote, and then you have the cleavage embryo over here, and then you have the morula, and you have the blastocyst. Before implantation, there are 4 stages. There are 23 stages in the embryonic stage of life, the earliest stage of human life. And 4 of those stages are before implantation. So someone in California who was infertile, who had no eggs, and she didn't want a donor egg. She said, well, could my husband and I adopt a frozen embryo? And it was at an adoption agency, and they knew and they said, well, I don't see why not. And they did. They adopted 20 embryos from another family. It was a mutual agreement. They were placed and accepted. And of the 20, only one survived. And here's a picture of her. Her name is Hannah. And Hannah is the world's first frozen embryo. And there's her book, when she was just born. And so embryo adoption was born with her. She was the only one who survived. Her 19 siblings, they gave names to. And but then people realized that we can adopt embryos and we don't have to do IVF. And so there are two organizations, Snowflake's Embryo Adoption Program out in California, and this one, which is the National Embryo Donation Center in Knoxville, Tennessee. This is a little baby who was adopted as a frozen embryo. And the couples who have done IVF, which they should not have done, now they have these frozen embryos. They don't know what to do with them. But life and adoption is the only, if they're not going to be parented, it's like an unplanned pregnancy, like in pregnancy centers. You either have to raise the baby yourself with help, and that can be done, or place it for adoption. And those of us in the pro-life movement really need to promote adoption better, because sometimes young women think their only choice is abortion. And sometimes people who have frozen embryos think, I can't raise 20 embryos, and they're tempted to discard them or give them to experimentation when they could be placed for adoption. And they could give the gift of life to their children and to an infertile couple who would adopt them and raise them as their own. So when Dignitas Personae was promulgated by Benedict, everyone thought that they would address this, because is this IVF? Is this surrogacy? Is this related? Is this licit? Because when the document came out, the official word from the Vatican, and it was supported by the USCCB, of course, was that it's an open discussion and we are not ruled out the practice. So they left it open. They did not prohibit it. They did not, the way they said it was a little, we did not rule out the practice, which said, well, some people think, oh, it's like surrogacy. Well, is it or is it not? Well, it's like IVF. You're not the biological parents. Well, is it IVF? What about embryo transfer? Because it's IVF and embryo transfer. If you just do IVF and you don't do embryo transfer, that's going to be an abortion because the child has been conceived. But now they're in the freezer. So can you transfer an embryo out of the freezer, carefully thought, and place it in the mother's womb for gestation, implantation and gestation? So this had never been done before until Hannah Strigi and her parents, Marlene and John Strigi, who are good friends of mine, did it. And it was blessed. They were Lutherans. They said yes. And actually, Hannah and her mother were invited to the White House when President George Bush vetoed, his first veto was to veto the embryonic stem cell research bill, because he said these little embryos are not stem cells, these are children. And he was holding up these babies and they were running around the White House and the Oval Office, and people began to see that embryos could be adopted. There were now more and more of these little embryos who were rescued by adoption, by a loving family that placed them for adoption, protected their lives, and selected a family. You can choose the family because it's the parents' decision. You can choose the family. You can have an open adoption, a closed adoption. even an anonymous adoption. Sometimes people have not mentioned IVF or frozen embryos to their family or their relatives and friends, and they want to be anonymous. So it's like any other adoption, just at an earlier stage, but people have had a lot of questions. And there are actually very good moral theologians on both sides of this embryo adoption debate, which I will talk just a little bit about in their last section. I wrote this book, A Handbook on the Moral Arguments in the Embryo Adoption Debate.
Dr. Elizabeth Rex at Donum Vitae Institute.org. Hey, we were all that size once. We were all in that embryonic stage of development. Every person, no matter what stage or age, ought to be loved. We need to be loved and treated with respect, at least at the basic level, not to kill one another. Right? So look, IVF needs to be outlawed, and all the children that are still frozen and alive, we need to figure out how to love them best. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. Welcome back to The Simple Truth. Jim Havens here with Dr. Elizabeth Rex, Donum Vitae Institute.org. All right, final segment. Here we go. Down the stretch we come. Elizabeth, share with us some of your book, but I do want to invite you to save a little bit of time. I would love for you to share the story before we close as well about where you were 30 years ago today on this great feast day of Our Lady of the Holy Rosary, Our Lady of Victory. Be a great way to round out the program today. But first, please, share on your book.
Well, thank you. I've written that book. I became a bioethics professor at Holy Apostles College and Seminary, and I taught seminarians and graduate students. I used Dr. William May's book. I recommend this to your listeners if they want a good book to learn about bioethics, beginning of life to end of life, womb to tomb, Catholic bioethics, and the gift of human life. It's an excellent book, and I taught that for 5 years. And so I learned a lot more about beginning of life issues and end of life issues. And so I began writing scholarly articles in the National Catholic Bioethics Quarterly, many, and I put them into this book. And so I've actually become somewhat of an expert in this topic, and I've even been asked to be an associate scholar of the Charlotte Lozier Institute, because this is all over the world. Every country in the world is struggling with all these issues about, there could be 12 million frozen embryos worldwide, and every country is struggling with what to do with them, and some of them, like every 5 years, it used to be, now I think it's every 50 years in Italy, Britain, UK, they empty out the cryostorage tanks. They just empty them out. And others have said no. And Germany actually has an embryo protection law in 1990. You cannot harm or kill an embryo in Germany. They passed a law right after Donum Vitae. There are a lot of Catholics in Germany. And you can only fertilize 2 or 3, transfer them all, no freezing, no testing, which is eugenics. And if you do, you'll be fined or imprisoned or both. They made it, real. You just don't harm, you don't experiment on any human beings, even if they're embryos. So, and then later on in Italy, they did the same thing. So Italy passed its own medically assisted reproduction law, and there are no frozen embryos in Italy. They followed the example of Germany, and Pope John Paul II was working with the pro-life legislators to pass a law that would protect these embryos once they've been conceived and make sure that they aren't given to research, that they're not discarded, that there are no extras, period. You can only do it if you're married, if you are medically infertile, you've tried to cure your infertility, you can only fertilize 2 or 3, no testing, transfer all of them, no pregnancy reductions, and you could only do it once. So they passed the law in Italy too. And that's when it hit the news in New York Times, that the Pope and the bishops were defending that law when it got challenged. They wanted to overturn the law because it really shut down the IVF industry. As you can imagine, no more freezing, no more extras. It just really, they lost all their business and they were upset and they were trying to overturn the law. And the Pope and the bishops came out swinging, preaching from the pulpit to stay home, don't vote to overturn. And it made the news that they waded into the political arena to defend these little frozen embryos and to keep that strict regulated law to regulate IVF so that embryos are protected. So that is, I think, the way for us to follow their example. And we need to regulate it so that no embryos are killed once they have been conceived. And in fact, very few.
I'll just break in.
Frozen either.
Yeah, I'll just break in real quick. I mean, I definitely have my concerns about this approach, which we've talked about off air, but we'll have you back to have that discussion a later time to address those concerns. So stay tuned for that, but please continue on.
So this is where I started the Donum Vitae Institute, because we needed to know what the magisterium teaches. And I'm sad, but there were many prominent moral theologians that were not following the magisterium. And so that's very serious. We have to study the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and we have to study Donum Vitae and Dignitas Personae to know what the Church teaches. So, for example, it clearly says that these embryos, the human being must be respected as a person from the very first instant of conception. Human life must be absolutely respected and protected from the moment of conception. Life once conceived must be protected with the utmost care. Abortion and infanticide are abominable crimes. To kill an embryo is an abortion. It's at any stage and in any manner. However it is killed, that is an abortion if it's deliberate. And then the Catechism of the Catholic Church, I found this, and it's number 2275, and it's from Donum Vitae 1:3, and it's beautiful, and I'm going to read it. One must uphold as licit procedures carried out on human embryos which respect the life and integrity of the embryo and does not involve disproportionate risks for it, but are directed towards its healing, the improvement of its condition of health, or its individual survival. So one of the big questions in the embryo adoption debate, is it licit to transfer a frozen embryo that's not yours, it's been abandoned, it's an orphan. Benedict calls them orphans because the parents don't come back for them. And in fact, many times they're completely abandoned because parents have to pay like $1,000 a year to keep them frozen. They don't want to kill them. They just walk away and they can't find them. And so they really are orphans. They can't find the parents. And so is embryo transfer, and Benedict asked the question, is the proposal of prenatal adoption licit? It's praiseworthy for its intention, but is it licit to transfer this little embryo, this little baby outside of the womb into an adoptive mother's womb? Of course, it should be transferred into its own mother's womb. That would be the mother and father, husband and wife who did IVF. They should be the first ones to transfer their frozen embryos to their mother's own womb. But there are theologians and ethicists that say, no, embryo transfer is intrinsically evil. And it would be a mortal sin for a mother and a father to transfer their own embryos, their own children, into their mother's womb by a technician. But it's a medical intervention. And when you go to Donum Vitae 1, it actually starts that way. It says, as with medical interventions on all patients, one must uphold as licit procedures for the survival of these little embryos. It's licit, must be considered licit. So embryo transfer must be considered licit. But there are some people who just say, oh no, that's wrong. Well, the magisterium says it's right. And so I'm going to go with the magisterium. And then let's say, well, but what about if it's not the couple's own? Well, first of all, homologous IVF is intrinsically evil because it violates the marital act, and heterologous donor sperm and donor eggs, that violates marriage. There's the conception of the child, there's another person, but not the implantation and gestation. That's what the church wants. Even if the child is conceived in rape, love that child, bring that child to term, and consider raising it yourself or placing it for adoption. So this is where we are.
It seems,
and there are many good arguments that say we should absolutely consider embryo adoption as the only moral option for a frozen, orphaned child.
Okay. Dr. Elizabeth Rex, Donum Vitae Institute.org. Outlaw IVF. Love the children that are already here. God bless you all.
That's right.